Yeah, so 44Con. I last spoke here 2015, first spoke in 2011. I think I spoke 4 or 5 times. When I was speaking at 44Con, it was back when I actually did stuff. You know, I actually innovated, I built, I changed things, and I had stuff to talk about. My career kept going. I ended up in more senior places, and actually I don't really do anything anymore. It's really quite frustrating. I spend most of my time getting other people to do things, the joy of being a CISO. So I haven't had a lot to say, really, because most of the time, if I was going to come up, it would be to whinge about people not doing what I tell them, which is not a great talk in its own right. During COVID, I was asked to go and help out on NHS Test and Trace. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I've sort of got stuck in central government ever since and picked up another role. So I'm currently the National CISO for Health and Care in England. I have to add that last bit because Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland their own national health services, their own care sectors. And it's a weird job. I'll talk about the scale of it in a minute, but it's not like being in a CISO in a small organisation or a big organisation. I was a CISO in a financial firm that was made up of 180 subsidiaries around the world. It's not like that. It's a sector. So I've got very different organisations, and they're all different sizes and scales. I'm trying to get the whole lot to a decent place. But I think, first of all, I'm going to start with some of what I did with Test and Trace. And the reason I want to talk about this is it was a really weird environment, a really weird thing to do. We did an enormous amount from scratch in almost no time at all. The NHS Test and Trace program itself, we directly employed somewhere around about 8,000 people. That made us roughly the same size or slightly bigger than the department we were part of. So if you imagine you were working for an organisation and they started a project and that project was then the same size as the organisation, it was a very odd thing. We had to have our own HR, our own finance, we had to run things separately. But we weren't just 8,000 people. What we were doing was we were the hub of tens and hundreds of organisations across the health sector, across technology, across government, and we were the sort of coordinating piece, bringing all those together. There was no good number, but probably about 40,000 people working for Test and Trace in one form or another. 8,000 directly employed, the rest all in outsourcing, other companies, other organisations that were working on projects with us. And we did that in 6 months. So from literally no people to 40,000 in 6 months. I mean, I've worked in commercial environments where we've been aggressive about delivery, and I'm now enjoying public sector, which is less of a focus. But I've never seen anything like Test and Trace. The only way to get things done was to break all sorts of rules all over the place. We'll leave it to the inquiry to work out how many of those were illegal. But what I will say is we got stuff done. It was wartime working. Everybody felt that every day we were in a bunker. We were trying to get stuff done. We were trying to win each battle. There were some really interesting trade-offs we have to make, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We built huge, big new systems, great big enterprise-scale systems that didn't exist before, some of which, messaging the whole of the UK population, some of which holding population-level data, a lot of which doing data analytics at scale and at pace. My team, I started 3 months into the program, and I was the security guy. By 6 months into the program, I was a team of 150, and we were barely keeping up with what we needed to do. And what was really interesting is we didn't fill that by recruiting. We did do some recruitment. Some of the later people, some of the more senior people came through recruitment. We did it by opening up our little black books and finding people we knew, people that come to places like 44Con, that come to the community, and we were saying to people, we need good people. We're doing Test and Trace. It's not going to last very long. Can you come and do this with us? And we had a lot of people take time out from their day job, shift what they were doing because they believed it was the right thing to do. It meant that we had a hugely high-powered team, and I've not seen a team like it before in terms of the skills across everybody in there. But we also had a level of commitment and purpose that we shared. and I'll talk about this in a minute, but one of my real challenges was actually getting people to work less. Because I had to try and keep that team on its feet. And actually, they were so committed, they were so focused on getting stuff done, that they were working themselves into the hospital. And that was a real challenge. But if you ever get the opportunity to hire someone who worked on that team, take them, because it was a brilliant experience, and they've all walked away with huge amounts of experience. We built lighthouse labs, we built mega labs, just building a new lab in itself. We built the mega labs from the ground up. I was standing on a gantry 4 floors up watching them put the walls in and things like that in that time frame. And that included the building, it included setting the sites up, it included the logistics to get all the tests in and out of the building, it included the robotics to be able to handle the tests, it included the data at the back end and the transmission, huge amounts of effort. And then it included the staffing, which was just crazy. It's just hard to get across the pace and scale of what we were doing. It was a very odd thing, but it's important to understand that when I come to talk about what that meant for us around security. The big thing is, within 24 hours of one of you going to one of those car parks where they took a test and put it in a bag, within 24 hours, that would have gone from that car park into the logistics supply chain, which when we started was about the size of Tesco's, and when we were finishing, it was roughly the size of Amazon in the UK. It got from us to whichever the appropriate lighthouse lab was, into the lab process and processed, the data extracted from it, collated into the systems, enriched with the other data we needed to understand it, and a report on the Prime Minister's desk within 24 hours of that swab going in your nose. And again, I don't know if anybody's worked in the public sector, this is unusual. It was just incredible. Now, we did spend an awful lot of money. And again, the inquiry will work out whether that was value for money at the time. We were told, basically, you need it, you get it, you do it. That's it. That introduced some real challenges. Early on, we were very siloed. I've got this job to do, I'm going to go and do it. You've got that job to do, you're going to go and do it. And what that meant was, so about 6 months into the process, we started seeing things getting a bit rocky because nothing really plugged together really easily, or if it did, it was a bit ropey. And then we had to go through a whole process of going, right, it's great you've built all these things at pace, you've done them, now we need to make them all work properly. And that was another big exercise. But what that meant, and the reason I mention that, I'm very proud of what we did at Test and Trace. I think it was controversial. There's a lot of political toing and froing on it. We'll see what the inquiry comes out with. But in terms of what we did, we saved lives, and we worked our guts out, and we delivered things that I've never seen delivered at pace, at scale, in the same way anywhere else. And there were some things we learned from that in the security. I definitely learned from it. So the first thing was, we were putting patients first. And if it meant that I was standing up a system that hadn't been tested, and because it would take me another 5 days to get the test done and any remediation work done, and in those 5 days I potentially could avoid 15,000 people getting COVID, I'm standing that system up because there is a measurable impact on patient outcomes. And what that meant was I was then taking the risk, and I had to clean up behind myself, and I had to make sure we had the response capabilities if it ever went wrong. If we are putting patients first, if we are putting the outcomes of this organization that we built first, and they are the most important thing, then you had to assume we were going to get technical debt. We were just going too fast for that not to happen. What we also knew was we were going to be stuck with a pile of technical debt when this was over, when the money went away, when the focus went away, when the pressure from the Prime Minister ringing people up directly and telling them to get stuff done. When that went away, we were going to be stuck with all these things. So we had to really be clear with the seniors what we were up to. We had to really document it, let them know it was happening, explicitly go into it. We also had to plan for what we were going to do when we came out the other side. And that was really important, because if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't have had capacity, we wouldn't have had capability to be able to fix any of this stuff, and we'd have been stuck with a set of technical debt for a long, long time. The other thing is, I talk about the program itself being 8,000 people. That was split into 4 major divisions. There was individual projects and programs running under all the divisions. Because everyone was running at such pace, I mean, literally at one point, we would talk to somebody on a Monday, on a Wednesday we'd talk to that same person, and they were doing something different because they'd been tasked directly by the Prime Minister or directly by one of the number 10 to do something different on a Tuesday. It meant that we couldn't keep pace with them very easily. And if we waited for them to come to a committee or send us a design for us to review or come to me for approval about accepting a risk, never going to happen. The moment I slowed them down, they would just bypass me and we'd never see it. So even though I was sitting there as the CISO of this organization, actually there was no way for me to control the security of this organization. I couldn't have them come to me. I couldn't be an ivory tower in the center and say, until you've got my blessing, you can't do this. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the real world anyway, but in Test and Trace, no way that would happen. What that meant was I sat down and I deliberately thought about how I built that team. And I realized what I needed to do was to put the advice that the organization needed and the eyes and ears and the skills that we needed from security where the work was. So I did have a central team. I had a central monitoring team, central testing team, central risk team. You know, those good things where we needed to be able to start pulling this stuff together. But what I built was a very big architecture team that was focused on individual divisions, as well as creating, and I hated it when I called them this, baby CISOs who sat in every division. And the thing I said to each of those architects and to those baby CISOs was, you know what the right thing to do is, do it. Tell me after you've done it. Don't come and ask for my permission. Don't become the guy that says, oh, I'll just go and check with Phil and see what he wants to do. Because we don't have time for that. And that meant not only I had to hire good people, so we had to be a bit careful about who we brought in, but I had to trust them to do their job to their skills. And it's, again, taught me a strong lesson around if you've got people who have an important job to do, care about it, and you give them the autonomy to do it, they will do it, and they will do it to the best of their skills. If you try and manage people that otherwise don't need it, you'll take something away from them. But it was an important part of if you're going to deliver at pace, you can't slow everybody down by becoming the blocker. The other thing that the pandemic did that was really both brilliant and unusual is we connected together huge amounts of organizations, huge amounts of data. So in the past, there's a lot of data in healthcare, there's a lot of places where it sort of pools and collects, but actually the pipelines to move it around and get it to where it's useful, the getting it from frontline organizations to the backline, getting it to the research organizations, getting it to the policymakers so they can make a decision, a lot of that was pretty slow, and a lot of that was Mandrolic and Excel spreadsheets and that sort of thing. We, like I said, built this 24-hour pipeline from a car park to the Prime Minister's desk. It was the first time that level of connectivity and flow of data had happened in the sector. And I tell you what, all the ministers and all the senior policymakers looked at that and said, now we know why everyone keeps talking about data and why it's important, and now we want lots of it. So the sector now is in a really interesting place because we are going full guns at interconnecting everything. Another challenge I'll talk about in the next bit of the presentation. But it meant that we were crossing a lot of organizational boundaries. It was no longer good enough that somebody said, oh, we've checked it, it's fine. Because actually, you've got 40, 50 organizations and sitting in the same pipeline. Not everyone's using the same standards, not everyone's got the same skills, not everyone's got the same capacity, not everyone cares the same degree. And you've got to work out how to get past that. So a lot of what we were doing was building partnering with the different organizations. I would run one meeting on a Wednesday for everybody who worked in my team, the 150 people, where we talked about what we needed to understand as a team. So, is it getting tough? Is anyone being a not very nice person? What is it we need to deal with? On a Friday, I got together my 150 people, but I got in representatives of every organization we were partnered with, whether that was a commercial organization, whether that was a government organization, a healthcare organization, anybody we were working with on security, they came to that meeting. And my job at that meeting, because I couldn't tell these people what to do on a day-to-day basis, they had distributed decision-making, they had their autonomy. My job there was to go and make sure I knew what the program, what Test and Trace was doing. What had we delivered in the last week? What were we going to deliver? What was the benefit we were looking at? And I brought that back and I made that link between why are we doing this and what they were doing as cyber professionals. Because frankly, a cyber risk guy or a cyber pen tester is not going to be able to turn around and say, how many more tests did I get through the process? How many people did we manage to get tested before they had to get put into quarantine hotels? How many, none of that was going to come directly out of the work we did. But everything we did contributed to that. And everyone was working so hard that if I didn't keep reinforcing the purpose, we were never going to keep the pace, because otherwise it just becomes a day job. And it was war working. Like I say, we were working for survival, we weren't working for the money. And to be fair, a lot of the people that came and joined us dropped their salaries, took lower day rates, and that because they wanted to do the job. And that was, again, something of huge value to us. Now, what we did have is, because we had all these divisions, all these projects, all these programs, and then associated with them all the suppliers. So there was, that 8,000 people included a lot of people from consultancies. The 40,000 people included a lot of people from delivery partners. It meant, we didn't have one code pipeline. I don't even know how many code pipelines we had. It was more than 10. We had developers all over the shop. We had code popping out of, our ability to sit down and say, here's the standard you must apply, and here's how we automate that process, and if you don't get this, not going to happen, because by the time we found that code pipeline, it's already on version 2 of whatever product they were building. So our only fallback on that position was testing. And I have never spent so much money on testing in 1 year as I did on Test and Trace. I mean, it was, I had a very high budget, and I went over the top of it, and I remember talking to the CIO, and he was like, spend what you need to spend, we'll work it out later. And that was fine. But it meant that we tested everything to the nth degree. We managed through those test results, because that was the other big challenge, having a central coordination point where we said, right, 10 problems there, 50 problems there, 4 problems there, 3 problems there. These are the criticalities. Have they been done yet? Are they in the next release? That level of coordination, we had to do that, because it didn't exist. We were running too distributed. But yeah, testing, it was, we had our in-house team. They did a fantastic job. And their job was really to pick up the stuff we didn't have time to plan for. So things would just pop up out of the woodwork. New thing, just got built, going to go live tomorrow. Can we test it now? Our commercial partners were rammed because we were using them at full capacity constantly. So having an internal team who could pick up those ad hoc requirements was a huge piece. And then our partners are, fantastic. We did a really good job at working with some security companies. 2T were advertising here. They were a significant partner to Test and Trace, and they delivered huge value, great partners, really appreciative of what they did with us. But then this comes to the next point. We had more work to do than capacity. So we had to distribute the decision making. We had to think about where the priorities were. We had to think about where the greatest harms were. But because everybody was so committed, because it was so fast, it didn't stop. It wasn't like we had an upswing and a downswing. We were at more than full capacity constantly. And because people were properly motivated to work on this stuff, it meant people were putting in 16-hour days. People were putting 18-hour days. It was crazy. I had people who worked themselves into hospital. I had people whose family had COVID. I had people whose family died from COVID while they were working, and they kept working. My job became, why are we doing this? But also, how do I stop my team killing themselves? And that was, again, a very unusual situation, because usually you're managing a team, and sort of, how do we get them to deliver more? How do we get them? Actually, what I was doing was, I was like, well, where's the limiter here? How do we know that these people are not going to put themselves in the ground? Because frankly, we can't find more people that quickly. And secondly, I don't want to kill people, And it was, again, a weird environment, a challenge you don't often have, where your team is so committed that they'll kill themselves working. The other really interesting thing is, so we had companies popping up out of the woodwork offering us free licenses to this, free consultancy hours, free this, free that. And we took on some of that stuff. But we effectively, we didn't, but we effectively had an infinite pot of money that we could spend. We effectively had people throwing big enterprise tooling at us for free all over the place. And we had a big team. The challenges we had was the coordination of delivery of what we were doing with what the infrastructure guys were doing, with what the various people delivering applications was doing. There was a coordination limit. We could only deploy so many things at a time. We could only do so much work, because somebody's got to understand that environment, somebody's got to change it, somebody's got to then sit and manage that tool and work out the outcomes from it. And so we had a backlog of free things to take on that we said no to, because we just couldn't cope. We deployed the stuff we felt was most important. We were really thankful for the help we got, but we did have to turn people away, because getting a free license is great. It doesn't give you your team to implement it. They'll offer you the pre-sale support or the post-sale support to come and do that for free, and that was great. But it doesn't then give you the extra people to go and implement that on the platform. It doesn't give you the people to go and make sure the change controls all get approved in their local change control boards. It doesn't get the people to make sure the next release on that platform or that product is built into it. So it was a really fascinating thing for me because I usually I'm limited by how many people I've got, how much money I've got to spend. This time I was limited by I just can't do this. There's just the organization cannot cope with the level of coordination required to deliver it. So, a few interesting things to pick out of that. You know, interesting lessons. We won't see it's like again, I hope. We never know. But it was a good time. It was good work. I think everybody who did it should be incredibly proud of what they did. And I think I proved to myself, you know, letting go of the reins sometimes means you get more done. I also proved to myself that it's better to have people that you can trust to go and do the right thing than to have people. So the fact that somebody's available, but they might not be quite the right fit, or something's wrong in your gut about how you think you're going to work together, or you don't, because you haven't got the time to deal with the problems that causes. What you need are the people, and it's a really hard and tough thing to do, and you have to find who amongst your people are really good at judging your inbound recruits. But if you don't have the bandwidth to manage people who aren't perfect fits for the role, who aren't going to be delivering at full pelt, and they're going to require oversight and that sort of thing, you can't do it, because it will slow everything else down. And it was tough, but, you know, like I say, it was a motivated mission. So we had volunteers. It was coming back to the sort of war working. It was a volunteer army. So following Test and Trace, I was in there starting to look at how we were going to merge the Test and Trace programme, the Public Health England arm's length body, into this new thing called the UK Health Security Agency. Very different organisations, quite a lot of work required, still not finished yet. At which point, this weird job popped up, which was the National Chief Information Security Officer for Health and Care in England. Now, they'd had people in sort of similar-ish roles before, but it had never really existed as it's been created. So I was I was a civil servant by that point. I'd switched from being a contractor to civil servant so I could just make decisions easier. I moved over as a civil servant in the Department of Health and Social Care into this post, and I ended up with a team which was roughly half civil servants, roughly half NHS employees, because they're not civil servants, they're public sector workers. And we sat then as the sort of policy, strategy, commissioning, oversight, governance, regulation, you know, telling everyone what to do and making sure they do it, basically, for the sector. And it was a fascinating thing to walk into. When I talk about the sector at scale, so I think I have responsibility for about 141,000 organisations. Now, a chunk of those are big enterprise organisations, acute hospital trusts, these sorts of things, multiple hospitals, all under one organisation, enterprise-level IT teams, big technology, but all the way down to adult social care, where I've got micro-businesses where they don't have any technology staff, they don't have a budget, they don't make any profit, and they maybe look after 2 or 3 people. I've got micro-businesses, I've got small business. You look at primary care, so dentists, opticians, GPs, they're all private businesses. And in general, they're small businesses. Some of them are getting towards medium scale as they start building out practices. Huge variation. I've also got some of the larger private healthcare providers under my regulatory remit. But the really interesting thing is the bar at the end here. It's our supply chain. We think it's about 80,000 organisations, but we don't properly know, if we're honest, because maybe 20% of our supply chain is contracted at a national level. Maybe 80% of it is contracted at a local level. And those local contracts, increasing visibility at a national level, there's a lot of infrastructure coming in, a lot of new processes, but we don't know who's bought what. And that comes back as an interesting problem for us to solve. But also, the other thing to bear in mind with this bunch is there is no thing as the NHS. I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek. There is no one organisation. You have a department. You have an arm's length body called NHS England, who are the commissioner of the NHS services. You have integrated care systems, which are integrated care boards, which look after commissioning at a local level. And then you have trusts, and you have care providers and everyone else, who are individual organisations who get commissioned to deliver services. They all have their own board of directors. They all have their own executive teams. They all have their own lawyers, their own contracts. They all have their own everything. So unlike a CISO in a big organization, even a distributed, federated organization, I don't have that, I'll talk to your boss will talk to you to get you to do, there's none of that. We're not all in the same organization. I am trying to convince 141,000 independent and autonomous organizations that as a group, we need to be better secured. We need to be more cyber resilient. They also don't all do the same thing. So the difference between an organization running acute hospitals, an organization running community care, somebody running social care, an arm's length body running regulation, an arm's length body running blood and transplant, managing all the blood in the UK, they all do very different things. So not only are they independent and autonomous, but they're different. So what works for one doesn't work for all, and they need different solutions. So we have, post-WannaCry, a fantastic national monitoring capability and incident response capability. Like to think of it as one of the leading ones in government, but I'll leave that for someone else to confirm. But that's brilliant for those big enterprise organizations who've got an enterprise-level socket for our enterprise-level plug. It's of no use whatsoever to those micro businesses. So we need different solutions in different parts of the sector. And that is part of the challenge we face. So looking at the challenges more generally, high operational pressures. I'm sure you hear about it in the news, people talking about, will the NHS make it through the winter? How much money is available in the NHS? We've got staff problems that's leading to strikes, all sorts of issues. There has never been so much demand and so much trouble with supply as there is now. There is enormous amounts of challenge around just too much to do. We've got huge backlogs on the back of COVID, huge new demands coming in from a population that's getting older. I think I've seen an estimate that if we keep delivering at the current levels of productivity, by about 2050, everybody in England works for the NHS. So we've got a real challenge where the productivity of the NHS needs to increase. And then you've got me rocking up as the national CISO going, and hey guys, why don't you think about your cyber resilience? So there's a certain amount of realism I need to have, but also it's about making it a story that they understand around why, when we have these big incidents, that has huge operational impacts. So if they think they're far behind now, see what it's going to look like when they lose their electronic patient record system for 3 months. They're much further behind when that happens. So there's a trade-off, and that's part of what we have to do here. I've talked about the fact it's a large, complex, autonomous sector, very limited cyber workforce. So if we have cyber specialists, they're all in the acute trusts. Almost nobody else has dedicated cyber people. What you'll find is that the people who are covering cybersecurity are technology infrastructure or they are information governance. They're not specialists in the area, doing good work, but they're not us. They're not the people that get it. They're the people that get told what to do. So one of our big challenges is actually, as we try and get more of the system to look after itself, we need more of the organizations out there to have the capability to understand what we're telling them. We're setting our expectations. They need to understand what those mean. That means they need people, they need resource. And we're going to have to grow it because everyone knows there's not enough people in the sector. Salaries are sky high. It's unsustainable for us to go out to market, really. I mean, we will, but we're not expecting to achieve a lot. We're going to have to sit down and do a long-term piece around our workforce planning and grow our cyber workforce ourselves. I mean, we'll assume we'll lose a load of people because we'll grow people with skills who will be valuable in the market, but we just need to keep that handle running. Otherwise, we'll just have empty vacancies. Supply chain vulnerabilities. So when WannaCry happened, huge amount of focus on the NHS, the NHS trusts. Lots of work done to improve their security, and they're in a much better place than they were. I have a longer conversation offline about whether they're in the right place, but we have dropped the number of significant national incidents we have by a factor of 10 since WannaCry. That really significant change. Brilliant. It's working. But the problem is, and especially in a sector like this, when you focus on one spot, the pressure moves somewhere else. And supply chain is our next big problem, because I would say probably 80% of the major incidents we've seen in the last 12 months have come out of our supply chain. It's not us that's getting attacked, it's them. And that is a huge area for change for us. Setting new expectations, engaging with suppliers, educating suppliers. I mean, I will say some of the medical specific software suppliers would come to 44Con and completely blow their minds. We're dealing with significant vulnerabilities in major products that were baked out of financial services products 15, 20 years ago. So not only do we need to be better at setting expectations, better at making sure that people are meeting them, a little bit more aggressive around our contracting, but actually we've got to go and educate our supply chain. Those 80,000 firms, now, some of them sell us toilet paper and some of them sell us services, it's different, but we've got to go and educate those people about what we mean, because they haven't needed to know that until now. So that's a huge piece of work for us over the next 5 years. Legacy technology, there's a real history in the NHS of sweating assets. And ironically, there's usually capital money. So if you want to buy a thing, you can usually find that money at some point during the year. If you want to buy people or services with revenue, that's harder to come by. So what tends to happen is at a certain point in the year, people make available capital and say, hey, we've got some capital underspend, who wants it? And people buy tin, they buy software, they implement it, but they don't buy the people that needs to support it. And over time, what that means is we've got this increasing on-premise state. It gets sweated, so it goes out of support. It will sit there for another 5 or 10 years because it needs to be, reinvested. Someone needs to find the money to replace it. And why would you do that on your 30-year-old network switch when you've got some sort of Gucci AI app on your phone doing diagnosis? So there is a legacy technology. It's a lot of organizations. A lot of them are underfunded. They're under pressure. They don't have the people to deliver it. It's not a surprise. But that's something we need to build for. We can't get rid of it. We want to. We're trying to. But we also need to build assuming that that's the problem we have. And then new digital data and technology. We are at the bottom of the hockey stick. So we have just seen the early beginnings of digitalization of healthcare. The value to patients. So getting every trust in the UK to have an electronic patient record system. We're still a couple of years away from that. Massive benefits to patients in terms of speed, of access to services, of reduction in the number of errors, those sorts of things. The ability for people to access GPs over the phone or over video calling when rather than having to do the 8 o'clock scramble to try and get an appointment, that's going to make a massive difference. The ability to book an appointment with your GP through the NHS app, that's going to make a massive difference. So, it's not just that. We've got AI coming out of the wazoo. We've got massive databases all over the place. I've never seen so many robots until I moved into health and social care, all over the place. You wouldn't necessarily, they don't look like robots, but we have robots for dispensing drugs, we have robots for printing the labels, we have robots for understanding which is the right bit of blood to give someone and to pull it off the rack. We have robots in the labs, all over the place, lots of automation, and that's increasing because our productivity challenge means we need to automate more. So over the next few years, the amount of digitalization of healthcare is just boom, it's going to go straight up. And that's a real challenge because as we become more dependent on those digital capabilities, we need to make sure either that they're going to run really resiliently, but let's face it, at the moment, we're not Google, we're not Amazon, so we're not going to be doing SRE and achieving those levels of resilience. So then we need to plan, what do we do when it's not there anymore? So at the moment, we train doctors in teaching hospitals to work on paper, and then when they go to work, they learn how to use an electronic patient record system. In a few years' time, we will only teach them about electronic patient record systems, and we need to plan for, well, what happens when it's not there anymore? Because they've not been trained how to do, they will not have been trained to use paper. Similarly, in social care, a lot of remote care come in, again, on the back of COVID. So we've got virtual wards in secondary care, but in social care, we've got an awful lot of what's called domiciliary care. So people come to people's houses. And one of the things we do there is vulnerable people is someone goes out and sees them once a week or once every couple of days, has a cup of tea, make sure they're still breathing, they're still upright, make sure they're happy, goes away and looks at the next person. We only have so many people to do that. It's a massive staffing crisis in social care. There's nowhere near enough social care nurses, and that's a huge other problem. So one of the automation opportunities we've got is monitoring, in-home monitoring. Can we tell if somebody's fallen over because we can hear it because we've got a microphone? Can we give them a fake cat that they stroke, and every time they stroke it, it sends a message back and says, yep, they're still alive. That's great when we can do that because it means we can care for more people. But when we lose local broadband, when we lose the central coordination point for pulling that data in, then we don't have enough people to continue the care we're providing. As we become more dependent on digitalization, which increases our productivity, when it goes away, the impact of it going away is much harder. So that is a big challenge for us right now because all of our current resilience sort of capabilities, and I will say our resilience teams are second to none. Brilliant. Hospital catches fire within 15 minutes. We've got people going to the hospital down the road. We're moving people. We've got ambulances in place. Stuff works. But the assumption is, physically, that this hospital catching fire and the one that's 5 miles down the road doesn't. As we move to a more converged digital environment, we lose the same digital backbone for a whole region. Suddenly you can't divert people just down 5 miles down the road, you're diverting them 60 or 70 miles down the road. It makes a big difference. So a lot of our resilience assumptions are coming under challenge as we increasingly digitize. Again, interesting place to work, healthcare at the moment. Lots of new technology, lots of old technology, lots of structural challenges. Now last year, there was an invasion. Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a point at which, based on our sort of history with Russia, we felt that there was a reasonable chance they might have a go at the UK. We might see some untargeted attacks on the UK. Probably healthcare wouldn't have been their first choice because we saw what happened with the Health and Safety Executive in Ireland. They didn't really mean to do it. They gave the keys up, that sort of thing. But that's not to say if we ended up in a situation where there was a more untargeted general aggro attack on the UK economy, it wouldn't hit us. So we then had to look at how do we increase the base level, foundation level, the hygiene level of our health and care system. And that, everyone always says it, you can't call it the basics because it's really hard to do. And it is really hard to do, cyber hygiene. But the problem is doing it fast when you've got no time at all to think about it. Cyber hygiene is hard anyway. You want to maintain your systems, you want to have a good patching process, you want to have a good system life cycle, you want to have good network security with local segmentation, you want to have a strong monitoring capability and instant response, you want your access control to work. These are the basics, the foundations. These are the things that if you get those right, most of the problems are really limited. They're all really hard. They sound like easy things to do, but you try and do that in a big organization and you're always going to have a percentage of the organization that fails compliance. You're always going to have something that doesn't work very well. And then trying to fix a load of stuff that doesn't work very well at pace while you don't have enough people to run the stuff you've got is not a winning proposition. So there's a real message here that we've been promulgating to all the seniors, the boards, the execs, which is this hygiene stuff matters now. We have to be dealing with this now because what we can't be doing is dealing with it when we're on fire because you won't have the time to cope. And that's a big message to land with them because they're used to buying technology, sitting in the corner and then sweating that asset for 10, 15 years and not thinking about it. And now we're saying, no, that's just not going to cope anymore. The other thing was, we were trying to make sure we knew the whole system was improving, even just looking at the NHS itself, 300-odd organisations, going out and looking at every organisation to make sure they've done what they've said. Because let's face it, some of them do it, some of them don't, and some of them think they've done it and don't realise they haven't, and some of them do it a bit and it won't have worked very well. Going out and checking that manually, no. That I'd spend all my money on people doing checking and no money on building new things or supporting and changing process. So data-driven assurance is a big part of our future, and I think it will become a big part of everyone's future. We've seen some of the early days of it in some of the things Google does, but understanding how things are operating from the data generated from the environment, and rather than saying, what data does my security tools give me, sitting back and saying, what is it I'm hoping to achieve? How do I know if I've got there? And then what data do we have or not have that would tell me I'm doing it? Is a completely different mind shift for a lot of people around security measurement, but we need that because without that, we're going to have to go out and look at things. And again, not enough people. We talked a little bit about this in terms of, you push the pressure down in one place and it pops up somewhere else. Inevitably, 141,000 organizations, very distinct, some of them well-funded, some of them not well-funded, some of them with skills, some of them not with skills. If you fix a risk in one place, it's going to happen somewhere else. It's just the nature of the beast. And we need to be able to plan for that. So it's no longer a case that we can sit down and create this perfect plan and say we get from A to B, and when we get to B, the job's done. Because when we get to B, C has just popped up on the other side, and we've gone, oh, crap, there's a new problem to go and fix. And that's something we need to build into the expectations of our seniors. It's not just that cyber is an ongoing thing and threats change. It's that actually we can't put all our fingers in all the dikes at the same time. So technical debt is untenable when your threat environment changes. We knew that there were a bunch of systems out there which were not as strong as we liked. And a lot of the organizations out there knew that that was the case. They also knew that they had a 5-10 year roadmap of how they were going to invest their money in their technology, and they knew that some of those things were not going to get fixed now. As important as they are, because other things need to happen first. Their prioritization was on delivering patient outcomes. Their prioritization was on, of the 15 or 20 things that needed to be improved, on the first 5. When the threat environment changes and suddenly that tech debt that didn't feel like a bad thing yesterday suddenly is exposing something a lot more than you would want to in that environment, you can't suddenly go from doing 5 things to 15 things with the resources you have and the plans you have. And again, this is one of those messages out to boards and execs where you might be okay about accepting some risk now, but if you don't already have a plan to fix it, that you just haven't funded yet, or you don't already have some spare capacity that you can apply, when I turn up and say, oh my God, everybody fix it now because we're going to come under attack in the next 2 weeks, you ain't going to do it. And so what we don't want is tech debt that feels fine to become an absolute nightmare in a changing environment. And the environment does change. We do see new things coming in. We do see new threats on the geopolitical side. And then the other thing is, even if you're going to take that risk, you need to explain to people what it means. And the reason here, I mean, you look at the health and care system, our clinicians are hugely powerful. If I could get to a position where clinicians stop buying technology and start telling people what their requirements are and letting technology people buy technology, we'd be in a much better place. But, they're passionate people. They want to treat their patients. They want to deliver their outcomes. And they have huge amounts of power to do it. Because that's what the organizations are there to do. We're there to treat patients. We're there to look after service users. And we're prepared to take risks. But if we don't have that narrative or story in place where people understand what it means when it goes wrong, yes, I've got a red vulnerability. Who cares? Yes, I could have a cyber attack. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything to me. If it means you're going to add 10% to your cancer backlog, if it means that the treatment rate for your cancer patients will drop to 20% of its current rate because you'll have less hardware available to do it, these are things that they can then relate to. A large part of our job is to not really talk to people about cyber as cyber. It's to talk to them about, why do you care about this? And I'll talk about this next. And this is the sort of, if I was going to leave you with something to think about, it's, why do you do what you do? Now, I am lucky enough to have reached a point in my career where I could be a bit choosy about what I do. And there are probably 2 criteria I now apply to any job. The first one is, do I care about the outcomes of this job? So is someone going to pay me a load of money to protect a load of money so that someone else can make more money? Do I care about that? Do I want to work myself really hard? Do I want to, maybe they pay me enough money. And the other thing is, and forgive the language, do I want to work with any arseholes? And there's a certain set of sectors where you can guarantee that you will be working with arseholes. So what I will say is, for me, I started making a choice, a very active choice, to work with people I wanted to work with and to work on things that I cared about the outcomes. Flip side of that is you end up working yourself too hard and get frustrated. Another talk, another day. But I tell you what, my satisfaction in my career has gone up dramatically in the years since I made that decision about how I was going to work. Everyone gets to make their own decision. I don't judge. That's where I am at. Why do we care? Because tech, data, and digital services are becoming so central to the delivery of services to the patients. If we lose them, it creates patient harm. So there's vanishingly few cases of direct patient mortality, someone dying from a cyber attack. The problem is not the mortality, it's what we call the morbidity, which sounds like the same thing, but fundamentally you get diagnosed later, you get treated later, and you recover later. And in some cases, while your recovery might take longer, it also isn't as effective because it didn't happen at the right time. Appointments get blocked. We switch from automated systems to manual systems, so our throughput goes down. These all have an impact on the delivery of services to patients, the delivery of service to people in care. We had a big incident last year, hit the press, the Advanced incident. That was very painful. We had, no significant, as far as we can tell, incidents of harm coming to a patient or a service user as a result. But we had a lot of missed care incidents. So a lot of times when people were supposed to have seen a carer and didn't see a carer or didn't receive the care they required, we had a lot of people who were receiving medication who, because their records became unavailable, had to go and be re-diagnosed and have a new prescription issued. That caused interruption to the care they delivered. So we also had a frontline set of organisations, and this is sort of the best thing about healthcare, but it's the worst thing about working in cyber in healthcare, is everybody in the front line then worked themselves to death to make sure that they delivered manually what used to be being delivered automatically. So first of all, that put huge pressure on frontline staff, and we're seeing some of the impacts of that because COVID had done that already. We did it again through the Advance incident for other things, and you know, the strikes are what they are. But because of that, it can sometimes be hard to pull out and say, here's the harm that happens as a result, because we can see what the potential harm would be, but when the event occurs, actually our harm levels tend to be a lot lower. And that's down to the nurses and the doctors and the administrators in the front line working their guts out to cope. And I'll tell you what, a business continuity plan is not, I'm going to work my people so hard that they want to quit working for me. That's not a good business continuity plan. So that is an interesting challenge for us when we're trying to articulate harms in this area. Also, our attack surface is increasing. Like I said, we're at the bottom of the hockey stick, but we're interconnecting things a lot more than we ever were. We're putting things online a lot more than we ever were. COVID pushed a lot of people to working remotely. A lot more systems became available outside of the closed environment of the health and care network. We have more digital solutions, more patient-facing solutions than we've ever had before. And that's only increasing. So our sort of outer edges are much bigger than they ever were. And that's why we care, because there's more of it. It matters more to our patients. And if we don't get this right now, we're going to be picking up these pieces for years to come. Okay, I spoke for longer than I was expecting. I'm going to have to plug our strategy. So this was published back in March. Fundamentally, two main purposes that we have and that our team has. The first one, improving the safety of patients and service users. So whatever we do, there's going to be a line that we can show that says why we're doing that activity and why we think that's going to stop somebody missing an appointment, missing a diagnosis, being treated later, further harm happening. But the other thing we have is 141,000 organisations. We can't manage this in a centre. We can't be paternalistic and know the best. You know, national team knows best. Do what we tell you. Just do this and it'll all be fine. Because we don't know best. Actually, it's such a wide and varied sector that we don't know everything about every organisation. We can't. So they need to be able to protect themselves. Now, I think it's pie in the sky for me to turn around and say everybody will have an appropriately sized cybersecurity team and they'll all understand what they need to do, and actually all we do is just check occasionally. That's not going to happen. We have some very good national services we provide. We need to improve those. We need to provide more of them. We need to cover more of the sector with them. But those services shouldn't replace the requirement for local organisations to manage their own risk, because if that becomes the case, they'll take loads of risk because they'll assume we've got it on their behalf. We need them to have skills, so we do need more people who are cyber specialists in the system. We need to provide better guidance, better expectations so they know what it is they're trying to achieve. We need to have our procurement frameworks in place so that they say we need to buy something to solve a problem. They can go and find somebody that we've already checked and said, yeah, that's not a bad solution. But ultimately, we need them to protect themselves. And some of that is going to be education of the executives. Some of that is going to be training courses to bring up skills. We're building a cyber profession for healthcare. But that's a long-term goal. That's why our strategy runs out to 2030, because you can't change a sector this large, autonomous, and complex by saying make it so. You've got to provide the support. You've got to set the expectations. You've got to drive the education. All of these things need to come together for us to make that change happen. And that's what we're trying to do, you know, nice, easy thing, not too much work. So that's really all I wanted to do. I think Adrian asked me for, you know, what are the things I'd learned over the last few years? What do you want to take away? I think my main takeaway to you is grab the money while you can, but think about what your purpose is. Because at a certain point in your life, you will realize, some people will realize, not everybody, that the purpose matters. And actually, the earlier you get there, the greater the satisfaction you get and the better you feel about the job you have. Best advice I can give you. And then the last bit I would say is don't be a CISO. Because you don't get to do anything anymore. I used to do things. I used to build things. I used to write stuff and convince people to change. You know, I spend my time in meetings. I spend my time asking other people where they're doing, checking their plans, reviewing business cases. You know, it's friend of mine once described himself as a CXO, and he always saw his job as to be one level down from a CISO, because that was the one place where you got quite a lot of autonomy, budget, and resources, but you didn't get all the other side stuff that came from being a CISO around the organizational politics and the governance and the processes and everything. If you want to do it, come and talk to me. I'll tell you how to get there. But I would say if you're looking at some point in the future of your career to move out of more technical roles and into more managerial or leadership roles, don't be a CISO. And that's it. Thank you for your time.